Looking at the gathered crowd, she smiled. To my classmates, remember this. Everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Be kind. Be brave enough to ask for help when you need it, and brave enough to offer help when you see someone else struggling. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change someone's entire world. After the ceremony, surrounded by her new family, Officer Thompson and his wife, the retired teacher, the diner owner, her classmates, and countless others who had become part of her story, she finally opened her mother's graduation letter. As she read it silently, tears rolled down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of sadness anymore. She knew, she whispered, looking up at them all. Somehow she knew I wouldn't be alone. The last line says, "Remember, baby girl, love always finds a way to reach us. Sometimes it just comes in unexpected packages." Looking around at all the people who had become her family, at the park bench in the distance that had led her to them, she finally understood what her mother meant. Sometimes the darkest moments in our lives lead us to the brightest futures, not because of luck, but because of the goodness that exists in people's hearts, waiting for a chance to shine. That evening, they all gathered for a celebration dinner at the diner. As the sun set outside, painting the sky in the same colors she used to watch from her old apartment, the girl realized something profound. She had not just survived her darkest hour, she had found her way home. 3 months can change everything. As spring flowers began blooming in the park where our story began, the same bench that once served as a bed now became just another spot where high school students gathered to study during lunch breaks. The girl who had once hidden in its shadows now sat there surrounded by friends, helping them understand complex chemistry problems. The transformation wasn't just in her circumstances, but in the small details that made up daily life. Her shoulders no longer carried the weight of constant worry. Her smile came more easily, reaching her eyes in a way it hadn't before. The dark circles under her eyes had faded, replaced by the healthy glow of someone who finally got to sleep in a real bed every night. Living with the retired teacher had turned into something beautiful and unexpected. What started as a temporary solution became a genuine bond between two people who shared not just a love for mathematics, but a deep understanding of loss and resilience. Their evening routine of solving complex equations over hot chocolate became legendary among the other students, who sometimes stopped by just to watch them challenge each other with increasingly difficult problems. Officer Thompson and his wife remained constant presences in her life, not as authority figures anymore, but as family. Sunday dinners at their house became a weekly tradition, complete with attempts to recreate her mother's old recipes. They weren't always successful. The smoke alarm still went off occasionally, but that just made everyone laugh harder, remembering her stories about cooking with her mom. The local diner where she worked weekends became her second home. The owner treated her like a daughter, teaching her not just about running a business, but about life. Customers would specifically request to sit in her section, not just because of her efficient service, but because she could explain quantum physics while refilling their coffee. One particularly meaningful moment came when she received her first paycheck. Instead of spending it on herself, she bought yellow daisies, her mother's favorite, and placed them on her mom's grave. But this time she didn't go alone. Officer Thompson's wife went with her, and they spent the afternoon sharing stories and even laughing as they cleaned up the gravesite and planted fresh flowers. Mom would have loved the garden, she said, arranging the daisies carefully. She always wanted to learn gardening, but we never had space in the apartment. She touched the headstone gently. I think she would be happy now, knowing I have people looking out for me. Her academic success continued to soar. When the college acceptance letters started arriving, the entire community held its breath. The day she opened the envelope from her dream university, the one her mother had always talked about, the retired teacher insisted on filming it. The video of her jumping up and down, screaming with joy as she read the full scholarship offer, became a cherished memory shared among all who had been part of her journey. But perhaps the most powerful moment came during her graduation speech. As valedictorian, she stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, her classmates, her teachers, and all the people who had become her extended family. She pulled out her mother's old phone, now kept safe as a precious connection to her past. 6 months ago, she began, her voice clear and strong. I was sleeping on a park bench, holding on to a dream that seemed impossible. I had lost my mom, my home, and nearly lost hope. But what I discovered was that sometimes, when you lose everything, you find out that there's so much more in the world than you ever imagined. She paused, looking at Officer Thompson and his wife in the audience. I learned that family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who choose to stand by you, who believe in you even when you've stopped believing in yourself. It's about a police officer who saw past his badge to see a scared kid who needed help. It's about a teacher who opened not just her home, but her heart. The retired teacher wiped tears from her eyes as the girl continued. My mom used to say that education was our ticket to a better life. She was right, but not just in the way she meant. Yes, I'm going to college with a full scholarship. Yes, I maintained my grades and achieved my academic goals. But the real education I received this year wasn't just from books. She pulled out one of her mother's sealed letters, the one marked graduation day, and held it up. I haven't opened this yet. I've been saving it for after the ceremony, but I know what it says. It says what my mom always told me, that I'm stronger than I think, that I'm never alone, and that love finds a way to reach us even when we think we've lost everything. The girl sat very still when she heard this news, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Then she did something that surprised everyone. She stood up and began to speak. Her voice was quiet but steady as she shared memories of her mother, of their Sunday cooking disasters, of the way her mom would dance around the kitchen while helping her study for tests. My mom always said that education wasn't just about books, she told the gathered crowd. It was about building a better future, not just for yourself but for others too. She would have loved this scholarship idea. She would have loved all of you. As the evening wound down, Officer Thompson noticed the girl standing by the window, looking out at the sunset. It was the same sunset she used to watch from her apartment, but now she wasn't watching it alone. The retired teacher was beside her, one arm around her shoulders, pointing out how the light refracted through the clouds, turning it into an impromptu physics lesson that made them both laugh. That's when Officer Thompson truly understood what community meant. It wasn't just about providing help or resources. It was about restoring what had been lost, not just a home, but a sense of belonging, of being seen and valued for exactly who you are. News travels fast in small communities, especially when it touches people's hearts. Within days of that night in the park, a quiet but powerful wave of support began building throughout the neighborhood. It started with whispers in the teacher's lounge at the high school, spread through church groups and community centers, and soon reached every corner of their tight-knit community. The first to step forward was the physics teacher, who had noticed something special about his star student, but never guessed the magnitude of her struggles. When he learned the truth, he couldn't hold back tears during his morning class. He kept his composure until the lunch break, then immediately went to the principal's office. I had no idea, he said, his voice shaking as he explained to the principal. She always had her homework done, always stayed after class to ask insightful questions. I thought she just really loved physics. He pulled out a stack of her test papers, each one marked with perfect scores. She was living in a park and still outperforming every student I've taught in 20 years. The principal, a normally stoic man, had to remove his glasses and wipe his eyes several times during that conversation. By the end of the day, he had called an emergency staff meeting. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The school cafeteria workers insisted on preparing extra meals, packaging them discreetly so no one would know they were free. The gym teacher offered her office as a quiet place to study during free periods. The school counselor set up regular sessions, not to pry, but to provide a safe space where the girl could talk if she wanted to. But it didn't stop at the school. When the local diner owner heard the story, she immediately offered a part-time weekend job, not because the girl needed it anymore, but because she wanted her to have her own spending money, a bit of independence. Plus, she added with a warm smile, someone needs to teach these young folks what real work ethic looks like. The community center opened its doors early each morning, specifically so the girl would have a warm place to study before school. The librarian started leaving coffee and snacks on her usual study table. Small gestures perhaps, but each one a thread in a growing web of support. One particularly touching moment came when the girl's classmates discovered the truth. Instead of gossip or pity, they responded with quiet admiration and practical help. They created a study group, though everyone knew she was the one who would end up doing most of the teaching. It gave her a chance to share her knowledge, to feel valued for her skills rather than pitied for her circumstances. The retired teacher who had offered temporary housing turned out to be a former math professor. She delighted in having someone to share her love of equations with, and their temporary arrangement started feeling more permanent with each passing day. Her home, filled with books and the smell of fresh-baked cookies, became a sanctuary where the girl could finally relax and just be a teenager. During one particularly memorable evening, the neighbors organized a surprise home-warming gathering. They kept it small, mindful of overwhelming her, but the love in that room was palpable. Each person brought something meaningful, not just gifts, but pieces of themselves. The local bookstore owner brought a collection of science books. The art teacher brought supplies for decorating her new room. The diner owner brought enough food to feed an army. Officer Thompson and his wife were there too, watching with quiet joy as their community wrapped this brave young person in layers of support and care. The officer's wife had tears in her eyes as she watched the girl explain a complex physics concept to the retired teacher's grandchildren, her face animated with enthusiasm. "Look at her now," Officer Thompson whispered to his wife. "Remember that first night? How she tried so hard to be invisible." They watched as the girl laughed at something the diner owner said, the sound bright and genuine. One of the most powerful moments came when the school principal stood up to make an announcement. He cleared his throat, clearly emotional, and revealed that an anonymous donor had established a permanent scholarship fund in honor of the girl's mother. This fund, he explained, will help other students who are fighting invisible battles while pursuing their dreams. Officer Thompson had to turn away again, his heart swelling with emotion. His wife, though, didn't miss a beat. "Of course, sweetheart. Take all the time you need. We'll be right here." As they waited in respectful silence, the girl pulled out her mother's old phone. The screen lit up her face as she dialed, and they could faintly hear a cheerful voice message playing. The girl closed her eyes, listening intently, as if absorbing strength from the familiar words. "Hey, Mom," she whispered after the beep. "I met some really good people today. I think things might be okay." Her voice cracked slightly. "I'm still studying hard, just like I promised. And I'm not giving up, never giving up." As she ended the call, Officer Thompson's wife reached out slowly, giving the girl plenty of time to pull away if she wanted to. But instead, the girl leaned into the offered embrace, accepting comfort perhaps for the first time since her mother's passing. Looking at them, Officer Thompson realized that sometimes the most important police work happened without sirens or badges. Sometimes it was just about being human, about reaching out to someone in need and showing them they weren't alone in the world. The headlights swept across the park as Officer Thompson's wife pulled up to the entrance. She stepped out of the car, and even in the dim light, you could see the kindness in her eyes. 20 years as a social worker had taught her how to approach situations like this, with gentle care and without rushing. "I brought some hot chocolate," she said softly, holding up a thermos as she approached the bench. "I thought we could all use something warm." The simple gesture seemed to ease some of the tension in the air. The girl accepted the steaming cup with trembling hands, the warmth seeping into her cold fingers. Officer Thompson watched as his wife sat down nearby, not too close, giving the girl her space. She didn't immediately start asking questions or making promises. Instead, she simply said, "Would you like to tell me about your mother?" Something in the way she asked, genuine interest rather than professional concern, made the girl's eyes light up slightly. "She loved teaching me to cook," she said quietly. "Every Sunday, we'd try a new recipe together. Usually messed it up somehow, but we'd laugh about it." A small smile crossed her face. The fire alarm was like our cooking timer. As the girl shared these precious memories, Officer Thompson's wife listened intently, occasionally asking gentle questions. But her mind was already working, mapping out possibilities, thinking of resources and connections she'd built over her career. "You know," she said during a natural pause in the conversation, "I work with a program that helps students in difficult situations. We don't just find them places to stay, we make sure they can continue their education without disruption." She pulled out her phone, scrolling through contacts. "In fact, one of my closest friends runs a small nonprofit just 3 blocks from your school." The girl's eyes widened slightly, hope warring with caution in her expression. What kind of program? They have a mentoring house for students, Officer Thompson's wife explained. It's not a typical shelter or group home. It's more like a boarding house run by retired teachers who volunteer their time. Students live there while finishing school with their own study spaces and everything they need to focus on their education. As she spoke, she was already sending messages, setting things in motion. Years of experience had taught her that when you found someone in crisis, you had to act quickly before they had time to disappear back into the shadows. I'm making some calls right now, she continued, her fingers flying over her phone screen. That house usually has a waiting list, but she looked up with a small smile. Sometimes exceptions can be made for exceptional students. Officer Thompson watched as his wife worked her magic, coordinating with her network of contacts. A retired teacher who lived near the school offered immediate temporary housing. The nonprofit director promised to fast-track the application process. A local church group volunteered to provide new clothes and school supplies. But what touched him most was watching the girl's reaction to all this. She sat straighter with each message received, each call made, as if physically feeling the support network forming around her. When Officer Thompson's wife mentioned that one of the mentoring house volunteers was a retired physics teacher who loved tutoring students, the girl's eyes actually sparkled. "Would you like to meet some of these people tomorrow?" Officer Thompson's wife asked gently. No pressure, no commitments, just a conversation over breakfast, maybe toward the mentoring house. The girl looked down at her worn backpack, then at the park bench that had been her bed for so many nights. "I have a test first period," she said hesitantly. "I can't miss it." "We'll have you there in plenty of time," Officer Thompson promised. "My wife can drop you off herself." His wife nodded eagerly. "And tonight we have a spare room at our house. Clean sheets, hot shower, proper breakfast in the morning. Just for tonight, while we figure things out. No strings attached." The girl's fingers traced the edge of her physics textbook as she considered the offer. "Could I?" She paused, gathering courage. "Could I maybe call my mom's voicemail message first? Before we go? It's just, I always tell her when something important happens." "You know what the hardest part is?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Sometimes I forget. Just for a second, I forget she's gone. Like yesterday, I found this funny meme, and I actually pulled out my phone to send it to her." She wiped her eyes with her sleeve, trying to maintain composure. Those moments, they hurt worse than anything. In the distance, they could hear the sound of an approaching car, probably his wife arriving. But before that reality intruded, Officer Thompson needed this girl to understand something important. "Listen to me," he said gently but firmly. "What you've done, keeping your grades up, staying in school, never giving up on your dreams, it's incredible. But you don't have to carry this weight alone anymore. Letting people help you doesn't mean you're breaking your promise to your mom. It means you're brave enough to give yourself a real chance at the future she wanted for you." The girl looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time that night, she allowed herself to cry. Not the quiet, hidden tears she'd probably been shedding for months, but real, soul-deep sobs that spoke of all the pain she'd been holding inside. As headlights approached the park entrance, Officer Thompson made a silent promise, not just to this remarkable young person, but to the memory of her mother. Whatever happened next, this girl wouldn't have to face it alone. Sometimes, he realized, the most important part of being strong is knowing when to let others help carry the load. As Officer Thompson listened to his wife's calm voice on the phone, he watched the young girl from the corner of his eye. She sat perfectly still, her shoulders straight despite the exhaustion that must have been weighing on her. Even now, she was trying to be strong, to maintain the composure that had kept her going all these months. "My wife's coming to meet us," he said after ending the call. "She wants to help." He noticed how the girl's hands tightened around her backpack at these words, and quickly added, "We can talk right here, on this bench. No one's taking you anywhere you don't want to go." The minutes ticked by in silence. The girl pulled out her physics homework, as if solving complex equations could somehow make this situation feel more normal. Officer Thompson noticed how she wrote each formula with perfect precision, her handwriting neat despite the dim light. "You remind me of someone," he said softly, breaking the silence. "My little sister. She was just like you. Brilliant, determined. Always had her nose in a book." He paused, choosing his words carefully. She was the first in our family to go to college. Full scholarship, just like you're working toward. The girl looked up briefly, curiosity momentarily overtaking her guard. What happened to her? She's a doctor now, he said, smiling. But the road there wasn't easy. Our mom got sick too, when we were kids. Not like your situation, but he stopped, memories flooding back. I watched my sister try to do it all, study, take care of mom, work part-time. She nearly broke herself trying to be strong for everyone. Something in his voice must have reached her because the girl's carefully constructed walls began to crack. I'm so tired, she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. I'm just so tired. The confession hung in the night air, heavy with months of suppressed exhaustion and grief. Officer Thompson felt his own eyes burning with tears as he watched this brave young person finally allow herself a moment of vulnerability. Yesterday was her birthday, the girl continued, her voice trembling. I bought her favorite flowers, yellow daisies, left them at the cemetery before school. She tried to smile, but it came out more like a grimace. I got an A on my chemistry test that day. She would have been so proud. But when I wanted to tell her, her voice broke completely. Officer Thompson had to turn away, wiping his eyes quickly with the back of his hand. In his 15 years on the force, he'd seen all kinds of suffering, but this quiet, dignified pain was almost unbearable to witness. The worst part isn't even sleeping here, she continued, the words now flowing like a dam had broken. It's the little things, you know. Like when I ace a test and I turn around to tell her, but she's not there. Or when I'm studying late and I can almost hear her voice telling me to take a break, eat something. She looked down at her hands. I keep her old phone charged just so I can call it sometimes, hear her voicemail message. The girl reached into her backpack and pulled out a worn envelope. These are her last letters to me. She wrote one for every big moment she knew she'd miss. Graduation, college acceptance, my first day of university. Her fingers traced the sealed envelopes gently. Sometimes I almost opened them, but then I'd have nothing left to look forward to from her. Officer Thompson felt his heart breaking. He thought about his own kids at home, about how many times he'd taken for granted the simple act of being there for their achievements, their struggles, their everyday moments. This girl had lost not just her mother, but her witness to life, the person who would have celebrated every victory and soothed every defeat. You've been incredibly brave, he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. But you don't have to do this alone anymore. He pulled out his phone, his decision made. I want you to meet someone, my wife. She's a social worker, but not the kind you're afraid of. She helps people find solutions, real ones that work for them. The girl watched him warily, years of careful self-reliance warring with desperate hope in her eyes. Will I have to leave my school? Not if we can help it, he promised. But you can't keep sleeping in this park. We're going to figure this out together, okay? All of us. As he dialed his wife's number, Officer Thompson looked at the young girl who had shown more courage and determination than many adults he knew. Sometimes, he realized, the most important part of helping someone wasn't fixing their problems. It was showing them they didn't have to face those problems alone. The park had grown quieter now, with only distant traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves breaking the silence. The girl sat still for what felt like an eternity, her fingers absently tracing the worn edges of her physics textbook. Officer Thompson waited patiently, knowing that some stories need time to find their way out. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I used to love watching the sunset from my bedroom window. She paused, swallowing hard. We lived on the 10th floor of the Blue Ridge Apartments. You could see the whole city from up there. Officer Thompson noticed her use of past tense, but stayed quiet, allowing her to continue at her own pace. The girl's eyes remained fixed on her textbook, as if the familiar formulas and diagrams could somehow make this conversation easier. Mom always said education was our ticket to a better life, she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. She worked 2 jobs so I could go to the best school in the district. Even when she got sick, she never let me miss a single day. Her hands tightened around the textbook. The doctors said it was aggressive. 6 months ago, they told us she had a year left. But they were wrong. The words came out flat, emotionless, as if she were reciting facts from one of her science books. She lasted 3 months, just long enough to see my midterm grades. Officer Thompson felt his throat tighten. In 15 years of police work, he'd heard countless sad stories, but something about the way this young girl spoke, the mix of pride and pain in her voice, hit him differently. The hospital bills took everything, she continued. The insurance wasn't enough. Mom had stopped working when she got too sick, and I couldn't. I tried to find a job, but I had to keep my grades up for the scholarship program. She looked up for the first time, meeting Officer Thompson's eyes. That was the last thing she asked me to promise her, to keep studying, no matter what. The truth of her situation began to dawn on him. How long? He asked gently. How long have you been staying here? She shrugged, trying to make it seem casual, but her shoulders trembled slightly. The apartment building gave us 2 weeks after everything. That was 43 days ago. The precision of her count revealed more than any emotional outburst could have. I couldn't let them put me in the system. Not now. I'm so close to graduating, and if I move districts, I'll lose my shot at the scholarship. Officer Thompson watched as she pulled out a folder from her backpack, handling it with almost reverent care. Inside were perfectly organized papers, test scores, grade reports, and a well-worn scholarship application form. I'm ranked second in my class, she said, a hint of pride breaking through her careful composure. By spring, I might be first. The scholarship covers full tuition and housing. Just 6 more months, and I'll have a real future. The reality of what this young girl had been doing hit him full force. While other kids her age were worrying about prom and social media, she had been surviving on her own, maintaining perfect grades, and keeping up appearances, all while grieving the loss of her only parent. I use the school gym showers in the morning, she explained, as if answering his unspoken questions. I joined every after-school club I could. It means I can stay in the building until 6 p.m. most days. The library closes at 8, and then, she gestured vaguely at the park around them. I found this spot the first week. It's safe here. Quiet. Good for studying. Her matter-of-fact description of how she'd organized her survival broke something in Officer Thompson's heart. He thought about his own daughter, about how many times he reminded her to clean her room or do her homework. Meanwhile, this girl had been out here, alone fighting battles no child should have to face. The teachers don't know, she added quickly, misinterpreting his silence. Nobody knows. I'm careful. I never miss class, never cause trouble. I just need to make it until graduation. Please. Her voice cracked slightly. Please don't report this. I can't lose everything now. Not when I'm so close. The desperation in her voice was palpable, but underneath it was something else. A determination that spoke of countless nights spent studying under park lights, of maintaining perfect grades while wrestling with grief and homelessness, of holding on to hope when most would have given up. Officer Thompson took a deep breath, his mind racing through possibilities and regulations, trying to find a way to help that wouldn't destroy everything this remarkable young person had fought so hard to maintain. He knew what protocol dictated, but he also knew that sometimes the right thing and the official thing weren't always the same. The whole scene felt surreal. The perfectly maintained schoolgirl surrounded by advanced textbooks, sitting on a park bench in the growing darkness. It didn't add up, and Officer Thompson had learned long ago that when things didn't add up, there was usually a story that needed to be heard. He made a decision then, one that would change not only his life, but the lives of many others in the community. Instead of following standard procedure, instead of immediately calling it in, he chose to sit down on the other end of the bench. Sometimes, he knew, the badge had to take a backseat to basic human connection. Why don't you tell me what's really going on? He asked quietly, his voice carrying no judgment, just genuine concern. Whatever it is, we can figure it out together. And as the night air grew colder around them, with the distant city sounds providing a gentle backdrop, he waited patiently for her to find the courage to share her story. Sometimes, he knew, the most important part of being a police officer wasn't enforcing the law, it was being there when someone needed help but didn't know how to ask for it. Officer Thompson hadn't planned on working the park beat that night. After 15 years on the force, he usually patrolled the busy downtown streets, but something had drawn him to accept this temporary assignment. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was fate. He would wonder about that for years to come. For the past week, he had noticed something unusual during his rounds. At first, it was just little things, a shadow that seemed out of place, the rustle of movement when the park should have been empty. Other officers had mentioned seeing similar things, but had written them off as probably just local wildlife or the wind playing tricks with the trees. But Thompson had been a cop long enough to trust his gut, and his gut told him something wasn't quite right. He'd grown up in this neighborhood, spent countless afternoons in this very park with his own kids, and he knew every inch of it like the back of his hand. The strange movements he kept seeing near the old oak grove didn't fit the usual patterns. That night, the air was crisp with the first hint of autumn. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness as he walked his route, the familiar crunch of gravel under his boots providing a steady rhythm to his thoughts. He changed up his patrol pattern, taking different paths at different times, hoping to spot whatever or whoever was causing those mysterious shadows. As he rounded the bend near the community center, something caught his eye. It was subtle, just a slight movement near one of the more secluded benches. Most people didn't even know about this spot, hidden as it was behind the flowering bushes that the park's gardener had planted years ago. His first thought was that it might be someone up to no good. In his years on the force, he'd seen all sorts of things in city parks after dark. But as he moved closer, his flashlight illuminating the area, what he saw stopped him in his tracks. There on the bench was a young girl in a school uniform. She looked up at him with wide eyes, clutching a backpack to her chest like a shield. What struck him wasn't just her youth, though that was surprising enough, but the perfect neatness of her appearance. Her uniform was spotless, her shoes polished, her hair neatly arranged. She looked more like she was headed to school than spending a night in the park. "Good evening," he said softly, keeping his voice gentle and lowering his flashlight so it wouldn't shine directly in her eyes. Years of experience had taught him how to approach situations like this. Though if he was honest with himself, he'd never encountered quite this situation before. The girl didn't respond immediately. Her eyes darted left and right, like a small animal looking for an escape route. But there was something else in her expression too, a quiet dignity, a determination that seemed far beyond her years. "I'm Officer Thompson," he continued, taking a small step closer but still maintaining enough distance not to seem threatening. "I don't think this is the best place to be at this hour. Are you waiting for someone?" He watched as she struggled with herself, clearly trying to decide how to respond. Her hands tightened on the backpack, and he noticed something that made his heart sink. Beneath the perfectly maintained uniform, her knuckles were red and chapped from cold. "I'm just studying," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying a strength that surprised him. "The lighting is good here." It was a clever answer, he had to admit. But 15 years of police work had taught him to look beyond words, to see the stories people try to hide. The way she sat, slightly hunched, as if trying to preserve warmth. The careful arrangement of her belongings, too organized to be casual. The shadows under her eyes that even the darkness couldn't hide. Then he noticed something else, a small stack of books beside her, not just one or two, but several heavy textbooks. Advanced physics, chemistry, calculus, serious academic materials. This wasn't just some kid hanging out in the park. This was something else entirely. "Those are some pretty advanced subjects," he commented, gesturing toward the books. "You must be a good student." A flicker of pride crossed her face before she could hide it. "I have a physics test tomorrow," she said, her voice a little stronger now. "I need to maintain my GPA." That statement, delivered with such matter-of-fact determination, hit Officer Thompson hard. Here was a young girl, clearly in some kind of trouble, alone in a park at night, and her biggest concern was maintaining her grades. Something about that struck him deeply, reminding him of his own daughter at home, safe in her bed, with all the support and resources she needed to succeed. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple as the last few visitors made their way out of Central Park. As the streetlights flickered to life, a young girl quietly emerged from behind the community center, her school backpack clutched tightly against her chest. She was small for her 16 years, but there was a determination in her steps that made her seem older than her age. She had gotten good at this part, waiting until the evening joggers finished their final laps, until the elderly couples completed their post-dinner walks, until the last dog walker disappeared around the corner. Only then would she begin her own routine, one that she'd perfected over the past few months. The girl's school uniform was immaculate, a pressed blue skirt, crisp white shirt, and polished shoes that she carefully maintained in the school bathroom each morning. No one at Lincoln High suspected that one of their top students, the quiet girl who always sat in the front row and turned in her assignments early, had nowhere to call home. Making her way through the winding paths, she headed toward her usual spot, a wooden bench partially hidden by flowering bushes and sheltered by a massive oak tree. She had chosen this location carefully. It was far enough from the main path to avoid unwanted attention, but close enough to the park lights to feel safe. More importantly, it was just a 15-minute walk from school. As she settled onto the bench, she pulled out her physics textbook. Might as well get some studying done, she whispered to herself, a habit she'd developed during these lonely nights. The upcoming test was important, and she wasn't about to let her circumstances affect her grades. Her mother had always stressed the importance of education, and now those words echoed in her mind more than ever. The girl had developed a system. She would study until the park grew too dark to read, using the fading light and nearby lampposts to illuminate her textbooks. Then she would arrange her backpack as a makeshift pillow, laying her extra sweater across it for added comfort. Her winter jacket, carefully preserved from better days, served as both blanket and shelter from the cool night air. But tonight was different. The usually quiet park seemed to hold its breath, and even the crickets' familiar chirping felt muted. Perhaps it was the unusually bright moon, or maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to dance differently among the trees. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. As she flipped through her notebook, reviewing the day's chemistry notes, a distant figure caught her attention. A police officer was making his rounds, his flashlight beam sweeping across the park grounds. Her heart began to race. She had managed to avoid security for months by learning their patrol patterns, but this officer was new, and his route unpredictable. She quickly packed her books away, trying to make herself as small and inconspicuous as possible. The bench's shadows had always been her ally, but tonight they felt insufficient. The officer's footsteps grew closer, his shoes crunching against the gravel path. She held her breath, praying he would pass by like all the others had before. But deep down, she knew this night would be different. The carefully constructed routine she had built over the past months was about to be disrupted. As the flashlight beam inched closer to her hiding spot, she clutched her backpack tighter, her mother's last words echoing in her mind, "Stay strong, baby. No matter what happens, stay strong." The light finally reached her bench, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The girl looked up, meeting the officer's surprised gaze, and in that instant, both their lives were about to change forever. Neither of them knew it yet, but this chance encounter on a quiet park night would set in motion events that would touch not just their lives, but their entire community. The cool evening breeze rustled through the leaves above, carrying with it the distant sounds of city life, a reminder of the world that continued to move forward, unaware of the significant moment unfolding beneath the old oak tree. For now, though, there was just silence, the held breath of anticipation, and two people whose paths had crossed at exactly the right moment.